All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our Civil War Roundtable meeting for this evening. And because we've been chatting away, I'm going to hand things over to Janet to introduce our speaker because I've done pretty much all the announcements we can do at this point.
Wonderful. Okay, at least I'm unmuted. I wanted to thank Todd Kislak for contacting us to share his presentation with us tonight. He is a longtime student of Civil War history and a particular interest in exploring aspects and themes of the war that have continuing relevance. He's a member of the Civil War Roundtables in both San Fernando Valley and Los Angeles. And last year, he spoke to these groups about the legacy and image of Robert E. Lee and how this impact is still felt today. He recently retired from the healthcare industry and he has a senior positions in marketing and strategic consulting. He holds a bachelor's degree in political science from Wesleyan, and he received his MBA from Harvard, but no bragging there, right, Todd? We want to welcome you. He's going to talk to us about the origins and development of the Southern economy.
Thank you, Janet. Let me bring up my presentation. David, I'm afraid I'm a little lost here.
Okay, you actually had a web page previously when we were doing it. We're seeing a screen that you're sharing right now, and you need to be able to bring up the web page that you had the information on. Still having trouble?
Yeah, I'm afraid so.
Oh, no worries. Let me do this. Okay. All right. We're actually seeing nothing right now. So if you click on the green share button at the bottom,
yeah,
you have an option to be able to share your screen, and it will give you, and it will say screen. And if you just share the entire screen, it's the easiest way to be able to do it. Do you have your presentation up already?
I did. Yeah.
Okay. And did we lose your video? I'm not seeing your video here. Yep, we lost your video too. Okay. I'm not seeing anything on your screen here, Todd.
Yeah, sorry, folks.
No worries. So you're actually sharing the screen to be able to share the screen in there. Okay, I see your video back. That's great. Now, if we just go over there, yeah, and go ahead and open it up and share your desktop is fine. And then if you go ahead and just open the presentation.
Yeah, I'm having trouble getting to it. That's the problem now.
Okay. And you're using a Mac, if I remember correctly, is that right?
Using a Chrome.
Chrome, okay. You should be able to do it. Just go ahead and open up the Chromebook there and just open your browser. Let's do this. Stop the sharing on there. Go ahead and open up the page so you can get your presentation open and just have it open up on the screen here. And let me know when you have it so that you can see it on your end.
Okay, got it.
All right, now if you go into the Zoom session, you'll see the green share screen option at the bottom of the Zoom session.
Yeah.
And then when it says it, you will see your presentation and you can just select your presentation and share that.
I'm back to the same spot.
Looks like we were getting close. And it went so well. It went so well when we did the rehearsal.
No.
We got it going. I know that we can do this. We did it once. We can do it again. let's do this on here. When you're sharing your screen on there, that when you go to be able to share it, it will say, do you have multiple monitors or do you just have a single monitor?
I have two monitors. I have
Okay.
a choice. Do I want to share desktop or application?
Okay. I would share the desktop. That way that you can share everything in there to be able to do it. And just go ahead and share the screen, whichever screen the presentation is on. If it's on number 1 or number 2, just go ahead and share the screen for whichever one is actually has the presentation. And then go ahead and do that.
Not seeing it. I push share and I'm back to the same place. Unfortunate.
So we're actually just seeing your Zoom screen right now is what we were seeing when we were looking at that. Let me see here. Okay. Let's try it again to be able to do the share. And if you can get it, when you go to open that up, if you can actually just get it so that you see the presentation, and if you can just click on the presentation rather than on the screen, let's see if we can do it that way to be able to bring it up there. All right, well, we have lost Todd for a moment. So hopefully we'll get him back here in just a minute, and then we can continue on. I'm going to pause the recording, or actually I'll just leave the recording. We'll edit this out because we don't want any of this in here for when we have that. But I did actually work with Todd a couple of days ago. I know that we have the ability to be able to do it. We did try it out on there. I want to make sure that he's using the same equipment that he was using previously when we get him back on here, and then we'll go ahead and take a look at that. In the meantime, I know that Janet, that you had been talking about getting other presenters. Have we been able to get other presenters, or to be able to get somebody to be able to help out with finding people for the role to be able to help find other people for our presentations? Actually, I have everybody muted here. Let me correct that part. I just realized that I had muted everybody so that we could actually have no audio issues. Now everybody can unmute themselves.
There we go.
Sorry
Thank
about
you,
that.
David.
Sorry. So I usually
I'd
try to
love
be able
to tell you about it.
I usually try to be able to mute everybody so that we don't have any interruptions, and that when we ran into those technical issues, I forgot to do that. So I thought maybe we could have a conversation about this while we're waiting for Todd to get back on here.
Absolutely. Let me tell you about our coming attractions. March 22nd, we have Meg Rowling, who is the author of First Fallen, The Life of Colonel Elmer Ellsworth, the North's first Civil War hero. This is a book she's been working on for about 10 years. It's been published by Savas Beatty Publishers. It's been reviewed in the Wall Street Journal by Harold Holzer, no less. And she is a Northern California author and is very excited about coming to talk to us about her new book. In April, we will have another author, Melanie Kirkpatrick. The title of her book is Lady Editor, The Life of Sarah Josepha Hale. Miss Hale was the editor of the Godey's Ladies book, which was the premier fashion and home magazine, kind of like the Ladies' Home Journal of its day during the Civil War. And she was a single woman, I believe a widow, but she took on the editorship of this and deemed that it would be a non-political publication, which was a little hard to do during the Civil War. So that's going to be a very interesting talk about how she ran that publication.
She also wrote Mary Had a Little Lamb.
That's right.
Okay,
So
well,
a woman of many talents.
Todd has returned.
Oh,
let's
good.
see if we can get
quiet down.
Let's see if we can get Todd back on here. Todd, do we have you back, and can we give this another
Yes, can
try
you
here.
hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, again, I apologize for the,
Just a quick question. Are we using the same equipment that we were using when you and I tested this a few days ago?
yes, we are.
Okay, then we shouldn't have any problem. We should be able to do this. Let's go ahead and just try it again. And when you go ahead and select to be able to do the share, if you just select the presentation itself, rather than trying to do the full screen, let's see if we can actually just make it work that way.
Yeah, the problem is I'm not able to access, when I push share, I can't access the presentation. It's not letting me do it. I will try again. I'm not sure I'm doing anything different.
There isn't anything that we should do in here that would keep us from being able to do that. Are we able to share the presentation? You have it online, is that correct?
Yeah,
How we are seeing that you're trying to share your presentation or your screen, and I'm going to stop that so that we can make sure that we're getting the one in here from Todd. Is it possible for you to be able to send me the link, and then I could, if you send it to me directly through the chat window, not to everybody, if you send it to me, and then perhaps that I can share it that way.
try that.
Not seeing anything yet, Todd. Okay, I see a direct message in there. Let's see if I can get that to come up. Okay. I just sent a message to request access to the slides. So if you can actually give me access, then I can do that again. Let me try it one more
I'm
time.
giving you access. What am I going to do?
So I'm actually requesting access in here. And so if you go over there, you'll see a user requesting access, and it'll come in from history in full color at Gmail. And if you just give me access to that, then I can actually open the presentation from here and advance the slides for you.
So you sent me a message on Gmail. Is that what you're saying?
It should be in the area where you have that presentation stored on Google Drive. And it should say that you see a request for access. You may see it in your Gmail in there. Me requesting access. This is one of the reasons why I know that Nick wants to get back to the in-person meetings, so we don't have to have the challenges of some of the technical issues that we're having here.
Okay,
We're
Oh,
very thankful, Dave.
It's happened before.
Yes.
All right, I'm getting something on here. Let me go and bring that over onto the screen. And I'm going to go ahead and do the share from my screen to be able to do that.
Dave, are we going to have to pay you twice your regular fee this month?
Yeah, yeah, it's a double nothing is still nothing, Janet.
Yes.
All right, so
Wonderful.
here is the presentation here. And let me see if I can just slide a couple of these things out of the way. And let's get Todd back up in our focus. There we go. I'll spotlight Todd for everybody. And Todd, Just to let me know, I have this one up here. Let me see. I haven't used this program before to be able to do this. Put it in the slideshow mode, presenter mode to be able to do that. Now, are we seeing it? Is everybody seeing the slide here? We should be seeing it on the first slide. And Todd, when you're ready, just let me know to be able to move it to the next slide, and I'll just advance the slides for you.
Okay, well, thank you, David. Thank you, Janet. Apologies to everyone for the technical difficulties. I will try and make it worth your while. And thank you for inviting me.
Cannot hear him.
I'm sorry?
Not hear you.
I'm hearing you fine, Todd, but if we perhaps, I don't know if you can adjust a little bit, but I'm hearing you okay.
Okay, I will try and talk a little bit louder for you. That's generally not a problem for me, I'm told. Again, I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all. As Janet mentioned, I've been a member of the San Fernando Valley and the LA chapters of the CWRT for, at least 5 years or so. So I'm pleased to have this chance to talk to you all. I was a resident many years ago of Pasadena and love to interact with you. And I do see a few names and faces that I'm familiar with. So tonight we're going to talk not about military matters per se. The focus here will be on economic matters.
Todd, I am getting a few people else that are mentioning that they're having trouble with the audio here. So if we could just check on your mic for that. And if I would ask if they could just turn their volume up on their end to be able to see if they can actually hear a bit better. But I'm hearing it okay. But I do see a few other people that were mentioning issues with the volume as well.
All right, let me make some adjustments here on my end as well. Is that any better, hopefully?
It's about the same. And I see other people saying that they have theirs at the maximum volume on their side for that.
I will do the best that I can for you.
All right, thank you.
So tonight we'll be talking about economic matters, and we're going to go through, let me show you what the agenda is going to look like if you go to the next slide. Okay. We'll start by a brief review of the economic situation right at the beginning of the war, both in the North and in the South. We'll start in the 1830s, 1840s, because what I found is that by the time we reach 1860, a lot has already changed. So generally, when we speak of the antebellum South, we tend to just treat it all as if it's the same. But there were a lot of developments going on prior to 1860, leading up to 1860, that really did affect the course of the war and the course of the economy thereafter. Okay. We'll then look at what the condition was after the war. How the South, the condition the South found itself in, and how it really set the tone for the Southern economy for many decades following that. And we'll see how the Southern economy at that point really diverged even more from the economy in the North and from the emerging areas in the Midwest and in the West. Okay. We'll work our way through to a more current situation in the South. We'll look for how trends and patterns set early on continued in many ways in the South, but we'll also keep alert to what some of those differences have been and continue to be over time. And then at the end, we'll take a look at, we'll try and peek out into the future. We'll look for a few harbingers of what the economy in the South may look like in the future, and what some of the takeaways that I would have to offer you at the end of this presentation. Okay. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so just to set the tone here. So what were the assets of the South? What is it the South had to work with? Well, it's very simple, really. They had two main assets. They had slaves and they had land. The economy was almost purely agricultural. The economy was essentially owned and controlled by a relatively few number of people. The government and the industry, if you will, the agriculture was controlled largely by the same people, the same families. Whereas early on in this country's history, when Virginia and the Carolinas were really controlling the agricultural South. The slave population was largely based in the North. But as cotton became more and more important to the economy, slaves were moved further and further south because cotton was so profitable and so slavery intensive. So that by the time of 1860, virtually half of all slaves were already located in the South, working largely the cotton plantations, but also the sugar plantations and other related agriculture. And we're going to be talking a little bit more about agriculture in slides to come. As I mentioned, when we talk about, people talk about the Southern aristocracy, the number of aristocratic families, if you will, was very small. Several thousand aristocratic families controlled virtually the entire economy. Now, I think it's important to point out that while that would imply that there was a heavy maldistribution, if you will, of income, the famous 1%, as we talk about, it's really not that different than in the North than it is in the South. The difference is that the number of people in the South was so much fewer than in the North, and of course there were all the slaves. So that the aristocrats, if you will, in the South really depended and agriculture really depended on those slaves. And we're going to talk more about the slavery population shortly. But all of the capital, all of the wealth, if you will, of those Southern aristocrats was all poured into agriculture. It was all they could do to keep up with the heavy demand that there was for the cotton and their other agricultural products. So sometimes people wonder, well, why didn't the South industrialize more than it did? Why did all the industrialization happen in the North? Well, the answer to that is largely because the agriculture was so capital intensive, and there were so few aristocrats to supply that money. Okay, so it was highly profitable to grow and trade in cotton. And so they just really put all of their eggs in one basket. Everything that was developed in the South was developed toward cotton and the other agricultural exports. We'll talk about the railroads in a minute, and I'll make that point a little further coming up. Whereas in the North, they were diversified. Sure, there was agriculture, but it was a completely different agricultural base. They weren't growing cotton, of course, in the North, or tobacco or sugar and so forth. In the North, they were largely growing foodstuffs, right? They were growing wheat and corn and other products for eating, for consumption. Not so in the South. In the South, the agriculture was all based on exports and profitability. Okay, so the South had a strategy, and the aristocratic families had a strategy of really focusing completely on agriculture, not focused on industrialization. And decided that was going to be the way that they were going to grow and manage their economy, with its advantages and disadvantages. I think another important point here to make about the South is it was highly rural, far more so than in the North. In the North, by the time of the war, there were major cities such as Boston and New York that had hundreds of thousands of people in them, Philadelphia. There was no such thing in the South. The only city that had a large population was New Orleans. They had a population actually over 100,000. The next largest, I believe, was Charleston, and that was about 40 or 50,000. But after that, Richmond was only about 10 or 15,000, and Atlanta at the start of the war was only 10,000. So they really didn't have any large urban population centers. Keep in mind that the whole population of the South, including the slaves, was about 9 million, of which 3.5 million were slaves. Okay, and of course the education system was very, very small. So it was, if you look at the whole picture, what you're seeing in the South is an agricultural economy, a small number of very wealthy people. You had a middle class of whites, and if you were white, you had a job. There were jobs available because there were so few of them. And then, of course, there was the Black population that basically owned nothing. Okay, next slide, please. All right, just a quick review here, pointing out some of the key economic differences between North and South. And some of this is very telling, okay? So I'll skip around here. I won't dwell too much. You look at the second set of columns here, the manufactured goods. Look at the huge advantage that the North had there. Okay. On merchant ships, this shows how the South really entered into the war with basically no naval capabilities at all, except for very small numbers, and were never really able to compete with the northern shipping or naval capabilities. The railroad tracks, that's an interesting figure here too, because the railroads were all deployed in such a way as to support agriculture. They weren't trying to connect cities, they were trying to connect plantations. And so that was completely different, of course, than it was in the North, which was there to largely connect cities. That created a big problem for the South when it came to moving troops around during the war itself, because it didn't always take the troops where the troops wanted to go. And there are plenty of examples of that. And then also just take a look at the iron production here. It shows how the South really couldn't compete when it came to creation of cannons, guns, railroad ties, and so forth. They had so few iron works. The main iron works was outside of Richmond, the Tredegar Iron Works. That's one of the reasons that the South chose Richmond as their capital, in order to protect that area. Beyond that, the capabilities were very small. There were iron works in northern Alabama. I don't know if there were any others, but those were the two main iron making capabilities, were in Virginia and in Alabama. Okay, and then also I want to point out on the banking capital, you see here that is interesting that the Northerners really didn't supply that much capital to the South. The South operated almost as a separate country for many, many years prior to the lead up of the war. This to me is an example of the economic estrangement between the North and the South that led up to the war, and may have well been a factor in the start of the war. Okay, next slide, please. And I'm going to answer this gentleman's question here in a minute. Okay, these next two slides, these next two slides are dealing with the very difficult issue of the economic value of the slaves. It's difficult to talk about here. We're talking about putting prices on the value of human life, but given the nature of the conversation here tonight, I think it's unavoidable. We have to address this in some way. What's interesting about this here to me is, let's focus on the period here between 1840 and 1860. Why do you see such a large increase in population here? Why such a big upward slope here? The driver behind this is in fact the high demand for cotton. As I mentioned earlier, slaves were being shipped from the northern part of the Confederacy down to the southern part of the Confederacy to take care of those cotton plantations. That, plus the fact that the plantation owners were pushing hard for the slave women to have as many babies as possible. And the average slave woman had between 9 and 10 children. So basically, from the time they reached puberty into the time they died, which might have been only a span of 20 years or so, they had on average, as I said, about 10 children. Now keep in mind that the United States only actually imported from Africa and from the Caribbean nations only about 500,000 slaves. Okay, the rest were homebred, if you will, through forced marriage, rape, forced breeding. Okay, by the 1860s, as you see here, there were about 3.5 million slaves. So you can get a sense of the big push for making more slaves. That, plus, of course, there was the constitutional limitation that by 1809, 1808, slavery, there was no more import of slavery, so they just had a major push to grow, to essentially breed their own. Okay, next slide, please. So in terms of value and pricing here, so this gives you a rough idea. So it shows that not only was there a huge explosion in the number of slaves, but their value went up at the same time. And again, this is all driven by demand, largely coming from the cotton fields, which in turn was largely coming from the northern states here in America, as well as England and France were the big cotton manufacturers. And cotton really could not be grown without the slaves, and the profitability of using slave labor for cotton just created a huge demand. So now, if you multiply out these numbers, so you take an average slave of $1,400 at the time, and you multiply it out with 3.5 million slaves, okay, and then you look at the factor in inflation, which I did. You have to multiply that by about 33, 34 times to get to $2,022. Okay, if you're following me, you get to a figure that in today's dollars is well over $120 billion worth of slaves. Okay, in those days, again, it would be about $3.5 to $4 billion. Now, just to compare that to the value of land, and I don't have a slide on this, but I did come across a figure that at the time of in 1860, the value of all land in the Confederacy was no more than $2.5 billion. Okay, what that means is, so the implication of that is that slavery was far more valuable even than the land, and nothing else came close to the value of either of those two assets throughout the South. Okay. Next slide, please. Okay. Just a quick look here at the agricultural deployment here in the upper left. You see the cotton fields. Look how expansive that is. This is right in 1860. Basically, they took it got to the point where the cotton was so valuable that they took every square inch that they could and converted it into cotton production. Right. You see here that there's some overlap between these different agricultural commodities, but not too much. Right. They managed to find, they grew wheat in Virginia and North Carolina, but not in the South. They grew tobacco also in Virginia and Kentucky, but not in the South, because cotton was still more valuable anyway than either of those two, and wheat wouldn't grow very well in the South. But those wheat baskets were very important, of course, because as valuable as cotton is, it has one major drawback, which is you can't eat it. So they had to keep up their production of wheat and other grains. Okay. Next slide, please. All right. I just threw this in here just as a basis of comparison, and I think this gives important insight to some of the causes for why the South pushed so hard to fight the war and to turn secession into its own country, because they knew what the value of Texas would be. They knew the value of what an expansion would be. It was known well before the war, and this was also one of the drivers for fighting the Mexican War. They knew that if they could expand, they had a gold mine in the state of Texas and Oklahoma. Now you couple that with the fact that the cotton fields were starting to become depleted in the Mississippi Delta, in the Carolinas, in Georgia. Cotton has a way of degrading, well, as many agricultural products do. It degrades the soil over time. That creates an inherent drive for expansion for land, and that was a big push. Now, keep in mind, as I mentioned earlier, you had only about 10,000 aristocratic families at most. You had another 5.5 million white people in the South, and so those people were all asking themselves, well, how am I going to get some of that cotton land? Where am I going to go to get my own cotton fields and have my own slaves? Well, and the answer was westward expansion. So what was the arrangement? Well, you support the Confederacy, you fight for the South, and yes, you'll have your chance to get land after the war. That, by the way, is a common bargain throughout history to offer to farmers. You fight, and then you'll get more land. The same tactic that the Romans used, 1,500 years earlier. In that respect, little has changed. Next slide, please. Okay. So what happened after the war? Well, for one thing, the South early on in the war made a major blunder. They decided to stop shipping cotton to Britain completely, to England, I should say. Why did they do that? Well, they thought that they had enough clout with their cotton to try and force England into supporting the Confederacy. That turned out to be a bad strategy. I mean, after all, Britain was the #1 country in the world in terms of the economics. They were not about to let an upstart of any sort, start to blackmail them and coerce them into joining a political alliance. So the British saw this coming years before the war started, and the British in turn started developing new sources. It took a long time, and in the middle of the Civil War, there was suffering going on in England from all those large factories where the cotton had stopped flowing. But it was only really temporary until Egypt, Turkey, India could come online with their cotton. It might not have all been the same quality, and they had a lot to learn, but they were able to, in large part, substitute for the Southern cotton. And over time, they became better and better and developed some very good quality cotton, as we all know. Okay. Also, after the war, by the time the war ended, labor costs had gone way up, right? No longer had slavery, had to pay these people. There were far fewer workers than there were before the war because so many of the Southern boys had been killed or maimed or wounded. And so they weren't available to support the Southern economy. So there were major problems in the South after the war with getting all of their agricultural markets back online. They didn't have the capital. After all the slaves were taken away, so their number one asset was gone, right? As far as the land, well, if they couldn't grow cotton, what was the land worth? So the land value went way down after the war, and I'll be showing you more about that in a minute. Okay, in fact, let's turn to that now. If we could turn to the next slide, please. So here, it's made it be hard to see some of the fine print. Basically, deeper red color shows, the deeper destruction of value, if you will, in the land after the war, for the reasons that I just talked about. They just didn't have the people, and they didn't have the capital to restart the cotton markets. And by that time, there was competition all over the world. So in that respect, the cotton markets were never in a position to recover. Okay, next slide, please. All right. Now here, if you look at the year 1860 and you see what the production of cotton was, you'll see it took about 15 years to recover that level of production. And then after that, it rose considerably as they got better and better at agricultural science, as they were able to develop more fertilizers, as they were able to increase yields per acre. All right. But as you'll also see in the next slide, please. So here was the problem with that. So the more they produced, the lower the prices went. And between the fact that they were producing so much and the fact that there was competition all over the world, the price of cotton just collapsed. It never recovered to anything like it was at the beginning of the war. So there's the South with loss of land, of the value of their land, loss of their slaves, and low prices in cotton. Next slide, please. All right. So here, some of the struggles that we're continuing after the war. We touched on some of these. I want to point out that there was a big depopulation in the South. I'm going to show you a slide on that. Post-Civil War, the immigrants coming in from Europe, they went right to the north. They didn't go to the South. The Slavs, Blacks, Italians, and so forth, all the European immigrants that came through in New York, Ellis Island and so forth, they just bypassed the South entirely. The South had its big influx of immigrants before the founding of the United States, right? When English, Irish, Scottish, and so forth came over, and then some immigration coming in from Ireland and Eastern Europe prior to the war. But the big waves of immigrants post-war did not move south. Okay? And I also want to point out here in my last bullet that the South continued to show a resistance to industrializing, even when they had nothing. Their instinct was to continue to try and find ways to rebuild and regain their former glory, to find, sort of build what they once had. They still weren't interested and didn't have the capabilities to urbanize or industrialize, and they didn't have the educational basis. They didn't have the college system, if you will, a way of a scientific base to become entrepreneurial and scientific. Next slide, please. All right. So what was the South to do? Well, what they did was they looked for ways. If they couldn't have slaves, they wanted to do the next best thing. And the way they sought the next best thing for them was sharecropping and other forms of rental, sharecropping. There was also, prisoner labor, sort of a loophole, right, to allow for prison labor particularly in certain states. So this is what the labor landscape looked like after the war, and you can see it was largely based on sharecropping and rentals. It was really the only way that they could go about with even subsistence living throughout the former Confederate states. Okay. Next slide, please. All right. In terms of wage rates, I found this one graph here comparing two of the northern states with two of the southern states. And what you're seeing here is a huge difference in wage rates, right? Where North Carolina, Mississippi, and the other states in the South would follow suit here. The wage rates were extremely low and remained that way all the way through decades and decades after the war, right? Whereas the states of the Midwest here, Ohio, Iowa, they had vast opportunities for growing all sorts of foodstuffs. They were in high demand. Labor, farm labor was in high demand, and so the wage rates remained very high in the South, in the North, compared to the South. Okay, next slide, please. But as I mentioned earlier, there was a lot of depopulation going on post-war. So this gives a quick overview of what this looks like. What you're seeing here is, all those negative numbers here of both the native whites as well as the blacks. Just shows that even after the war, and this is net of, loss of soldiers, for example. It doesn't even count them. You'll see here a very clear trend of depopulation going decade after decade after decade, right? Especially as you look into the early years of the 20th century here, when the automobile industries, the steel industries were starting to pull workers from the South into the North. It wasn't just the black workers moving, the blacks moving up north to get industrial jobs. It was the white too, and it all came at the expense of the Southern workforce. And again, keep in mind that that going into the Civil War, there were only 5.5 million whites in the North, in the South to begin with, and here they lost let's see, this would be about 2.5 million of those. And on the black side, you're looking at 2.5 of the 3.5 million who had moved out of the South. Right? Okay, next slide, please. Just a quick look at this. Another way of looking at these numbers here, you see a major drop here in the percentage of blacks living in the South going into the early part of the 20th century. It's also interesting, and I had read about this, that there seems to be a small uptick, but noticeable uptick in the number of blacks moving back into the South. I think there are a variety of economic and cultural reasons for this. It's not a very strong trend, but it is a noticeable trend. Just to be aware of, and this trend continues into the 2020s. But again, I think the numbers today are 57, 58%. So not a huge difference, but it's somewhat of an uptick. Okay, next slide, please. Here, comparing per capita income among different regions around the country. So if the United States as a whole is at 100, you'll see that the Northeast remains very strong and well above average all the way through. North Central sort of holding its own through these years. And then there's the South. You'll see that the South is making just glacial progress here in coming up to an average, the average U.S. Right, and then the West is very strong. Of course, you'll see even from the start, even from the the early days of the gold rush and so forth. The Western states had a relatively very strong economy due to their economic base of mining and agriculture and so forth. Okay. Next slide. So here, just a quick look on education. So these are the Confederate states, and if you look at the numbers here, if the U.S. average here is a 100, you'll see that that all of these states had a very difficult time approaching anywhere near the U.S. average. Okay, and this was persistent all the way through till certainly through the 1940s. I expect if I had the numbers handy, through the 1950s and maybe even beyond, I wouldn't see much of a trend. I don't know exactly what these numbers look like today, but I'm fairly confident in saying that they remain well below the national average in these states, or at least in most of these states, if not all of them. Okay. Next slide, please. Okay, just a quick look here at social mobility. All right, another way of looking at economic health here. You see in the early part of the 20th century what it looks like here, and then you'll see how this changed over time. So what we're looking at here, and again, look at the note at the bottom. You're looking at average income rank of children born to parents in the 25th percentile. Children born to parents of the at the 25th percentile. Right. So what we're looking at here is basically no change in the southern states at all. Right. There are some other interesting trends in other parts of the country. We're not going to get into that now. What you're seeing here, I think the takeaway here is there's virtually no upward mobility going on in the former Confederate states, with a few exceptions. And we're going to talk about those exceptions in a minute. Next slide, please. Okay. Another way of looking at social mobility here, again, the red is the poorer performance, and the green colors are the better performance. These are the chances of reaching the top fifth from the bottom fifth. So moving from the bottom 20% into the top 20%. And again, it looks like in the South, the chances have been virtually almost unnoticeable, indistinguishable. Okay. Next slide, please. Okay. Real GDP, again, this is just a per capita real GDP. Just to look, the red and the pink show lower income levels. Okay, and also lower asset levels. We often don't talk about that, but asset levels are far lower in the South. Value of homes and so forth, much lower through the South, and that has been persistent, all the way through the South's history. Next slide, please. So again, I wanted just to mention here on a couple of exceptions, because you may have been wondering, well, look at all the successes in Florida, look at all the successes in Texas, and a few other cases. What I've noticed here is that the successes in Florida are largely in the parts of Florida that were completely undeveloped at the time of the Civil War. So they weren't really, the war was no factor for what was going on in southern Florida whatsoever. Northern Florida, however, looks a lot like and has a lot of economic and cultural similarities to what you do see in the southern states, such as Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and so forth. So northern Florida, the Panhandle, that looks a lot more like the South than the southern part of Florida does. Okay. Now you look at Texas. Now, if you'll remember, Texas, we saw the east side of Texas was cotton-producing land, right? But that didn't include Dallas, San Antonio, or even Houston. And of course, there was no oil being developed at the time. So it was really the oil industry that made Texas, the powerhouse that it's become, and has been able to, fuel its expansion. But at the time, the areas that were in Texas that were developed, the eastern end of Texas, they have and continue to remain largely below average, even for Texas, in terms of their economy. Okay, I would also point out that Texas's role in the Civil War was very, very limited. By the time that the North had control over the Mississippi, Vicksburg and New Orleans and so forth, they basically knocked Texas, off of the playing field. They weren't even able to ship their own foodstuffs, their cattle they were growing or their cotton. And so they lost access to support of the war. And even the number of troops that Texas sent to fight the war, similar to Florida, was very small, 10,000, 15,000. Whereas in total there were, about 1 million Southerners that participated in the war. So again, here what I'm saying is cities like Miami, Orlando, Dallas, Houston, and so forth. These major modern cities are the exception rather than the rule, and they had they didn't share the history that the rest of the Confederacy did in terms of its culture or its economy. Okay. Next slide, please. Okay, just a quick look at education. And again, what I'm trying to do here is create an overall picture of the economy in the South. And so I'm looking at different aspects of the economy to give us a sense of where this thing is going. All right, what's happening in the South today that can tell us something about where its economy is going in the future. What you're seeing here is there continues to be a major lag in education throughout the South. The light pink shows here the lower levels of education in terms of percentage of people who have completed high school. All right. Next slide, please. Okay, just a quick look at this. Most of us are familiar with the fact that unionization is weak in the South. This has an impact, of course. That's not so much a judgment, if you will. I'm not saying it's good or it's bad. It's just something to be aware of. And if you couple that with the wage rates and the income levels in the South, it's just another way of rounding out the picture here. The one exception here in the South is the state of Alabama is considerably higher. I don't know all the details, but there is a lot of industry in northern Alabama. Okay. Next slide, please. Okay. This is a Gini index. Some of you may be familiar with what this is. This is an income distribution, if you will. And so the dark purples show the higher levels of maldistribution, if you will, of income and assets. The greatest divergence, if you will, between those who are wealthy and those who are not. And again, there's a consistent pattern going on throughout the former Confederate states. Next slide, please. Okay. And here's a slide on healthcare. My own background is healthcare. So I had a couple of comments to make on this. We should keep in mind that healthcare is the largest industry in the United States. So that's a reason alone to consider it when you're looking at economic health, right? $1 out of 5 in the economy in the United States, $1 out of $5 of our GDP is spent on healthcare. And considering the fact that income levels are lower in the South and life expectancy is lower, I'm pretty sure that we're spending, the Southerners are spending more than $1 out of 5 on healthcare. If you look at this life expectancy, this is a stark picture here showing, and I estimate the average here in total, and I did look at the numbers themselves, of about 74 years throughout the southern states, as opposed to a national average of about 81, 82 years, both for male and female. Little less lately because of COVID and whatnot, but it's about that. So then I was curious. I looked at, well, if I say that the average life expectancy in America was 74 years, or is 74 years in the South, how does that compare to other countries? What other countries are at that level? And the countries that are at the level of 74 years life expectancy are Egypt, Bangladesh, Peru would be another example, Iran, right? So that's the neighborhood, if you will, that the life expectancy in the South is at, all right? And this is far different than you'll see in, France, Germany, England, Italy, Japan, and so forth. Virtually, there's no there's no major industrial economy in the world that has life expectancy levels like this. This life expectancy level is much more akin to what you would find in a third world country. And I just think it's important to make note of that. And you can see how starkly different it is than the rest of the country. I also look, by the way, at these similar charts for diabetes and heart and cancer and obesity and so forth, and they look exactly like this. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so we're coming toward the end here. I wanted just to point out a couple things that are more relevant in our world and looking forward here. What are the effects of climate change looking out ahead? And this one really took me by surprise. You see here, there are some major concerns going on, well, throughout the country, of course, but particularly in the southern states here. I did a little bit of research as to why that is, what's going on here, and it's largely related to temperature. It's heat related, and again, we're talking about largely rural agricultural economies where agriculture is can be under major threat from climate change. That plus the fact that the water levels are rising in the seas throughout, and they're covered, of course, they have the Atlantic, Gulf of Mexico, and so forth, affecting the coast. Serious issues ahead for the South in terms of climate change. Okay. Next slide, please. I think I missed one. We missed one back there. I had one on Apple just before this. No. All right, then I want to speak to it. I wanted just to, I don't want to end this presentation without a ray of hope and positive news. So I wanted to talk for a minute about what's happening in the research triangle, right? That's Raleigh, Durham, Chapel Hill, North Carolina, right? They just landed a major investment from Apple, right? You may have heard about this. I think it was announced in June. In the Raleigh, Durham, Chapel Hill Research Triangle, Apple is building a major headquarters. That's on top of, they have now science, healthcare, aerospace, major research going on through the universities and those corporations. They were developing a fantastic powerhouse of both government, corporate, and academic knowledge economy type of industry going on there. I think that is really where things are going in the South. If they're going to be successful, then that's the kind of a role model that they should be looking to replicate. I'm not sure where else in the South they are doing things just that way. But I did ask my brother, who went to Duke University, I said, how long, which is right there in the middle of the research triangle, how long has this been underway? When did they start working on building this research triangle? He says the original vision goes back to the late 1960s, okay? And now they have this, what I think is like a crowning achievement of getting a major headquarters from Apple. So what I see going forward here is, where can they build the next knowledge economy? Where's it going to be? There are a couple of possibilities. One that comes to mind is the Nashville, Brentwood, Tennessee area, which has become a major healthcare hub, right? Tennessee, Memphis also, shipping hub. These kinds of economies need to think in these terms, where you need cooperation between government, academic, and corporate to build that kind of economy, to draw in people with high levels of education, build up the education capabilities, bring in cultural support in terms of restaurants, art, things of that nature, to keep these people happy, to keep those kind of people happy, so they don't want to go automatically to the Bay Area or Los Angeles or Boston. So the South really needs to think about how they're going to draw in that kind of caliber of workers, which unfortunately is in fairly short supply. You look at a city like Atlanta, for example, and you think, well, they must be doing great, right? Well, they don't have those kinds of businesses. I mean, the big businesses in Atlanta, for example, Home Depot, Delta Airlines. You know, these are fine companies. These are Fortune 500 companies. But these aren't the cutting edge technology, knowledge-based kinds of companies that I'm talking about here that they've managed to do in North Carolina, or that they do here in California. And that's the kind of thing that that the South needs to look for if they're going to build in the future. Okay, next slide. And I think this is the takeaways. Okay, so what are we to make of all of this? Well, I think what I've tried to point out here is that there's been a consistent pattern throughout the South's history of showing a lot of cohesiveness, a lot of similarities between those southern states all the way through. From the 1830s right till today, there are trends, there are threads, if you will, of that history that's apparent today. All right, and those trends, those threads, continue to differentiate the South, not only culturally but economically, from the rest of the country. All right, the South is clearly modernized and grown their economy at a far slower pace than the rest of this country. It's it's something to contemplate as to just why that is. All right, my own view is that the South's values that they've been adamant to hold on to. All right, works somewhat at odds with a desire for growth, for expansion. And so it's very hard for them to do both at the same time, preserve their values and still grow into a modern economy. And I think that many parts of the South are still trying to work through that tension, if you will, that dilemma. All right. But ultimately, the answer will have to be some combination of the two, of merging the old South with the new South, so they can find their way forward to the future. Okay. Thank you, and I'm happy to take questions if you have.
Go ahead and set everybody so they can unmute themselves. Also, if you want to be able to post a question into the chat, you're welcome to be able to do that. I actually do have a question for you while we're waiting to be able to have other people put in their questions or to be able to unmute themselves. You made a lot of references here in regards to the amount of things that were related to the Civil War and how that affected them going forward. If we set aside the Civil War, would you have expected the same type of thing? Because it was roughly an agrarian, agricultural type of society in there for that. They didn't have the capitalization that they had in the North. Would you have expected that to have just continued even without the Civil War? Is the Civil War the cause of the things that we're seeing or contributing to that? Or is that the Civil War was just a byproduct there? What is your opinion on that?
Yeah, well, David, I find it treacherous to try and delve into the what if questions like that. My short answer is I don't know. But I think another way to look at it is, from the start, the South and the North had very different cultures. They had a whole different value system. The original settlers coming in from England, Ireland, Scotland were not the same people in the South as North. If you wanted more information about that, I would refer you to a book called Albion's Seed, which talks about the various regions of the British Isles and where different groups of people settled. For example, the Puritans in New England, the Irish, the Ulster Scots, the Ulster Irish Scots in the South, the Cavaliers in Virginia, the Quakers in the mid-Atlantic states. And you look at how those cultures were really brought over and developed their culture and the economy along lines similar to what they had at the time. So whether they would have all had a meeting of the minds at some point without a Civil War, I don't know. I would be skeptical of that. I would say probably not. The war, it took the war to resolve that. It took the war to resolve the inherent issues in the Constitution, federalist issues, racial issues. None of that would have happened without the Civil War.
Okay, thank you. There's a couple of people who are pointing out that the North Carolina Triangle was mentioned on the first slide, and a couple of people asked to be able to see that. So
Yeah.
this is the first slide.
Let's do that. I'm sorry, this was the slide that I wanted to have. So here, it's just this is just a little kind of a mini version here. But you'll see here, you know, Raleigh, Durham, Chapel Hill. That's the triangle there in the north central part of the state, and they're just doing a fantastic job down there, developing industry. I mean, it's and not just for national companies, but many international companies. GlaxoSmithKline comes to mind as a leading British pharmaceutical company that's made its headquarters there. Other European, Japanese companies have made their headquarters there. So that, and of course, those three cities all have, you know, outstanding universities: UNC Chapel Hill, Duke University, University of North Carolina. I'm sorry, there's another one there. The name doesn't come to mind offhand. And they've all collaborated. I mean, they really set out with a long-term, decades-long vision of what they wanted to do, and it's really affecting the economy of the whole state, you know, all for the better.
And David, I see that you've got your hand up there if you want to go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hi. First of all, thank you for a very interesting talk and very nice slides. I'd just like to ask you about your modern conclusions. We're seeing for the first time population going into the South. California and other northern states have actually lost population, and they're losing congressional seats because of it. You also see modern technological companies moving into the South, perhaps because of more favorable business policies of the state. Companies like Tesla, great manufacturing companies like both domestic and overseas, maybe because of more favorable, again, labor policies and cultural attitudes towards work. So could you comment, maybe there is a shift into the South now because of fast changing dynamics, even something like banking. The Bank of America, which was in California, is now in North Carolina, and Florida is attracting a lot of interest that way. People are leaving New York, they're leaving Manhattan, and there may be also a great change because the COVID that we've been dealing with has made the necessity of having office space or being where everybody else is being less important.
Yeah, no, I think you make some very fair points here. I would answer it this way. Every part of the economy is modernizing into becoming knowledge-based, technologically based. It's the only way to compete. And it doesn't matter, even in agriculture, right? So it's happening everywhere. My point here is that it's been happening slower in the South than in other parts of the country historically. Now, I do agree that, you know, that having a dispersed workforce that's communicating, you know, remotely is a major opportunity for the South for people to move into a lower cost housing down there, and yet be part of the economy with, you know, of New York based or LA based companies. So that is a major opportunity, and I certainly hope that more you know, southern parts of the southern economy take advantage of that. I think they will. But again, I'm concerned that the South has historically always been in a catch-up mode. Okay, and that I would also say that, you know, that the move, for example, of an Apple computer to the South still remains more of the exception than the rule. And the companies that are moving, for example, in the finance business, like Goldman Sachs is opening a major facility in West Palm Beach. Southern Florida works in a very different way than Northern Florida, but still, it's Florida, and so it's bringing up the you know, the game, if you will, for the entire state. But are things really changing in Northern California, Panhandle, Louisiana, Mississippi, South Carolina? Well, maybe in South Carolina things are changing. They have, for example, a major Boeing facility now in South Carolina. So it's happening. I just don't think it's happening at a very at a pace that's going to allow them to catch up. So it's all relative.
Well,
relative to other parts of the country.
Well, for example, again, in an area like education, 30 years ago, California was very proud, or 40 years ago, of being number 1 or number 2 in the country. And by some metrics, it's down there with Mississippi now. And so there is some powerful dynamical changes going on, and the world changes at a much faster rate today, so that perhaps we're not even aware of what we may be looking back on 20 years from now.
Well, I'm hoping 5 years, 10 years from now, we can. I would be delighted to be able to show a change in some of these graphs and some of these statistics. Nothing would make me happier. But thank you.
There's another question here that's in the chat that says, what precipitated the spike in slave prices in 1840? I believe they're talking about this diagram here to be able to see that. So if you could comment on that.
Right. Yeah, I mentioned this briefly before. The spike largely had to do with the spike in demand for the South's agricultural products, primarily cotton, but not only cotton. So huge demand for more slaves. And so, yes, the slaveholders could control and manage the number of slaves they had. When they needed more, they could make more, or they could bring them down and buy them from the north. So they could, buy slaves that were working in the tobacco plantations in Virginia, for example, and bring them down to pick cotton. But they could also breed more, and so there were situations where they would increase the breeding of the slaves, and there were other situations where they would decrease the breeding of the slaves. And I read about this, for example, in Maryland. The economy, had industrialized to the point where they needed less slaves in the 1850s, right? And actually going into the Civil War, Maryland was touch and go for a while. It was all that Lincoln could do to keep them from joining the South. But the slave population had diminished considerably because they had sold them off to the South. And so, if you're making slaves, 9-10 slaves per slave woman, you can really drive the population very quickly. So that's, at the end of the day, that's what's behind it, is the breeding power.
Nick made a comment on that relationship as well, and he was talking about here. He said, wouldn't it be an increase in the planting caused by the theft of the land of Native Americans in the 1830s? The planting would have reached a level where intensive slave-based agriculture would be profitable by the 1840s, increasing the demand for slaves.
Let me see this planting caused by the theft. Yeah. Well, there were Native Americans that were taken as slaves. There was some of that, but there was a lot of pushback about that. There were a lot of people who didn't want that. I mean, a lot of the slaves had already been moved into the Midwest, right? Trail of Tears and so forth. They were out of the South by the time of the Civil War. So they would have to have been relocated and repopulated back into the South. And it was just easier for them and more profitable for them to bring the slaves in from Africa, rather than try and convert large numbers of Indians who are accustomed to a very autonomous lifestyle, and to try and move them into the South. I mean, they had already been moved out. Choctaw and Chippewas and so forth had been moved out of Florida and Alabama and so forth, and Georgia out to Oklahoma, and they were not about to move them back in to try and repurpose them, if you will. It was much more profitable for them to, and easier to use what they considered more docile humans. And they didn't always consider them humans. But again, the racial element was such that they definitely considered Negroes to be less human than the Native Americans. There was a lot of respect for the Native Americans, keep in mind, in many circles. Not so for the Negro at the time.
Todd, I think you misunderstood what Dave was saying about my comment. It's the land transfer from the tribes that during the Jackson period is basically stealing the land. That arable land was mature and plantable by the time you get the increase in the demand for slaves and the price increase.
Okay, so therefore, what? I'm not sure.
Therefore, you've got a bunch more plantable land for slave crops, driving the price of the slaves up.
Oh, okay, yeah, sure. I think to the extent that that the southern states appropriated and stole that land from the Native Americans, created more opportunity to bring in more slaves, to grow more economically profitable product. Sure, I agree with that. That's a fair point.
There's another comment in regards to the third university in the Research Triangle. George mentions that it's the North Carolina State University in Raleigh.
Right, thank you. And I'm told that those three universities have very high levels of cooperation. I couldn't tell you the specifics of what that means, but I imagine they're integrating their courses. Professors, maybe even students take courses at the different schools, connected in with internships with universities and so forth, and just have a very integrated system. And it's a system that takes many years to develop. And so I do hope those kinds of systems are underway in other parts of the South. I'm just not aware of them.
A couple of people offering you thank you for your presentation. If you do have other questions or comments, you can actually just please post them into the chat, or if you want to go ahead and unmute yourself, you're welcome to be able to just make your comment verbally as well.
Well, again, I want to thank everybody, and again, I apologize for the short delay there at the outset. I made it worth your while. It's been a great pleasure. Thank you again.
Well, Todd, it was great to be able to do that. I'm glad that we were able to get through the technical issues, and I was able to help you, even if we had to cooperate together. That we came together as a team and we got it done there. So it was glad to be able to see that happen for you on there. Any other questions or comments here? So if there are no other questions, I do want to thank you for your time, Todd, and thank you for sharing your presentation with us. The research that goes into this to be able to actually compare it either from the pre-war stage through the Civil War and then to the current date is something that we don't see often in presentations, to be able to see that that sort of entire dynamic of that. So it's appreciative to be able to see that span of history in there and how that's impacted us to the current day. So thank you very much for your presentation, and I want to thank everybody for participating here. I will see if Nick or Janet have anything else for us to be able to wrap up, comment on perhaps upcoming presentations. Otherwise, that we can close out for the evening.
Janet, do you have the description handy for next month's talk?
I think I covered that. It is Meg Groeling, who is the author of First Fallen, The Life of Colonel Elmer Ellsworth, the North's first Civil War hero.
Yes, you did mention that.
Yes. And that is actually a very interesting talk, because he was considered the first Union hero after being killed completely not in battle. And so she's going to have some interesting stuff to talk about.
Looking forward to that.
Well, thank you for this evening's talk. That was a lot of fun. And thank you, David, again for mastering our technical stuff.
Of
and
course.
We'll see everybody next month.
All right. Have a good evening, everybody.
Thank you all.
Have a good night.